welcome to the KC Arts Beat Report. I'm Patrick Neas, and my guest today is really a very good friend and an extremely knowledgeable person, and a person who has had a really big influence on the cultural life of Kansas City. You might not be familiar with Ian Coleman, but he has probably trained many of the musicians that you are very familiar with and love. Ian Coleman is the chair of the Fine Arts Department at William Jewell College, and he has a lecture coming up. Hello, Ian. So glad to speak to you today.
Hello, Patrick. That was a very kind and generous introduction. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I'm delighted to be here. This is great.
Sure. What is your lecture called?
So the title of the lecture, it's rather long-winded, but it's Getting to the Heart of the Matter, Identifying the Driving Force Behind Common Practice Music and What It Reveals About Western Society. So that's what I'm planning to do. Get to the heart of it.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Go
what
ahead.
would you say the gist of the lecture will be? What
Well,
can people expect?
That's it. So I should maybe as by way of background, I should say that this is part is it's the Carl F. Willard Lecture Series, and this is an award given for a teaching award given on the William Jewell campus every year. I jokingly say it's a double-edged sword, the award, because you get the award, but then you also have to give a lecture as a result of it. So it's a sort of an award that comes with some work.
I see.
Um, and there's been a long group of faculty who've received this over the years. And as I think through those people and those names, it is just an honor to be listed among them. I mean, they are the people who have shaped and formed the educational experience at William Jewell College for many, many years. And I am honored and humbled, quite frankly, to be included among them. And so this is that award, and this is the lecture that comes with that award, and I'm delighted to do it. It's actually been a lot of fun to put it together. And so now to get to the actual answer to your question, what I'm proposing in this lecture, and again, I'm going to try not to give too much away, or there'll be no point in coming to the lecture. But uh, I, what I'm proposing in this is that there is a fundamental relationship in the music of Western art music, and particularly Western art music in what we call the common practice era, and that relationship is foundational to all of the music created that can generally be called to be common practice music, that is under the common practice music theory system. And so that's what I'm getting at. I'm saying there's a fundamental relationship, and that if we can get to the heart of that, then we have a way of understanding the driving force, the internal mechanism, if you will, the very core of so-called classical music.
That sounds very heady. Now, this is music theory, and that's one of the major things you teach at William
That,
Jewell College.
That's right. I mean, the fact that I won an award for teaching, and the fact that most of my teaching is in fact music theory, meant that I felt like I really should try to deliver a lecture that is at least in part, if not completely, centered around a musical theoretical concept or idea or process. And so, yes, in many ways, it is quite heavily music theory based. Although I hope that I'm going to be able to present that theory in a way that an average listener, because there will be many people attending these lectures who are not trained musicians, and so I want to present it in a way that I share enough music theory that you understand what I'm getting at, but you don't necessarily have to have a thorough or deep understanding of music theory to get the point. And part of the reason, Patrick, that I think I can get away with this is because it is a musical experience. So I will play a couple of examples at the piano, very simple chord progressions or scales that I think will cause a reaction, an emotional reaction, if you will, almost physical reaction in the person who's listening to it in such a way that you'll understand innately that there is a relationship there. And then if you don't quite follow exactly what that relationship is, as I unpack it theoretically, you'll still fundamentally understand that it must be there because you felt it. And at the end of the day, I think music theory, if it does anything, it must be understood that it serves the practice of making music. So theory underpins or underscores or explains why you feel the way you do when a musical event happens, a musical situation occurs. And so that's that I want to lead with here. Do you feel this? Do you understand this? Do you get intrinsically that there's something going on here? And if you do, well, then perhaps we can now move to I can try to explain what theoretically is going on that's creating that reaction in you.
You say that music theory is, essential to making music, and I think everyone can understand how that's true. How about the importance of music theory for just appreciating music for the average person out there who is not a professional musician?
Right. I think so. That's an excellent question. I think this lies at the heart of theory study, if you will, is that we must be careful that we understand that theory often comes after practice. And it comes after practice as an avenue to understanding and appreciation. So a composer does something, maybe I should say a performer often does something and creates musical sound. And we then analyze that to figure out, well, how did that happen? What happened? What were they doing? What was going on behind the scenes? And that enables us to recreate it, of course, which is helpful, but also perhaps then to add to it. And so the appreciation of what was going on adds a depth of understanding which can then result in the hands of a creative person to a sort of an additive process where they add some small amount to that creative moment, that understanding, the understanding that they've gotten from what was going on in that musical moment, and they add something to that, and that moves the art form forward. So I like to think that theory often trails behind practice. You understand theory, you put it into practice, and you add to it in the moment. And then you go back and you come back and you analyze it again. So you understand, well, what did I actually do? And that process, that cyclical process of of applying theory, but adding to it in the moment and then analyzing what you did and then going through that whole process again, that is what kind of keeps the art form moving forward in many ways.
Wow, fascinating. I don't want to steal your thunder because I want people to go to your lecture. I'm sure it's going to be, overflowing with information, but maybe to give people just a taste of it, you have an interesting theory about how music theory kind of follows cultural uh, trends, or
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
you talk about that a little
I
bit?
will, yeah. I mean, I'll go ahead and I'll give you a little taste of where I'm going to start on this particular lecture, and that is that I will absolutely be leading with an assumption that I am making. And if you agree with the assumption, then I think there's a chance that we can go down this road together. We can go through this lecture together, and you might come out of it with an understanding of what I'm getting at. If you don't agree with this assumption, then it might be a little harder. So just stay put in the lecture and enjoy the reception afterwards, sort of thing. So the assumption that I'm making at the beginning of this lecture is that art reflects the society in which it is created, and that enables. If you believe that, then you can kind of see you can buy into the concept, the idea that the artist is involved in a sense, holding up a mirror to society. And as the artist does that, the members of society can look in that mirror and decide to what extent do they like what they see reflected in that mirror, and what might they want to change as a result of seeing what's reflected in that mirror. So if art truly does reflect the society in which it is created, then it becomes both a confirmation of the good things and perhaps a challenge to those things which are a little bit more difficult about the society. And that relationship, the relationship you have to the art and the artist, and the reaction you have to the art and the artist, is often a way of both confirming and perhaps pushing back against the norms of society. So that's the premise I'm coming from. That's the assumption I'm making. And if you can say, yeah, I can see that, I can understand that, I can see how art reflects the society in which it's created, well, then there's a fighting chance that I might be able to make my point well, and you might be able to kind of agree with it at the end of the lecture. Um, and I know there's an awful lot of potential nuance in that statement. So I understand that it might not be an all or nothing. You may not 100% agree or 100% disagree. And that's, of course, the beauty, the richness of ongoing conversation. I would hope that a lecture like this would spark ongoing conversation that might occur after the fact. And I look forward to that as much as I look forward to delivering the lecture in the first place.
Just to give people a concrete example of what you're talking about, in the classical era, you assert that there are aspects of music theory that actually reflect or support, I don't want to put words in your mouth, the imperialism of the time, the European imperialism.
Yeah, again, again, part of the lecture will be to be very careful about defining terms, right? Because the last thing you want to do is, or I want to do, is make a sweeping statement, the idea that all music does this or all music does that. That's very dangerous, I think. So, without getting too much into the weeds here, in the lecture, I will define very clearly the terms that I'm looking at, the specific music I'm looking at, the specific time periods, the specific what we call eras of music, and I am primarily looking at certain types of music that were created in what we generally refer to as the Baroque, the classical, or the Romantic eras, which spread from about 1600, give or take, to about 1900, give or take, in terms of the span of history. And so, yes, in that time, of course, that happens to be a time period in which imperialism and colonialism were prevalent ideas. They were prevalent ways of going about business, if you will, that often the business ventures that were taking place in that time were wrapped up in this idea of imperialistic or colonial endeavors. And so my argument is that if indeed music reflects the society in which it's created, then perhaps some of the music will have concepts or embedded within it will have relationships which perhaps reflect that colonial idea that it is okay to go and take your concepts, your ideas, your society, and potentially it place that on the top of or even subsume other societies within it. And that's getting quite deep in terms of the way that we view history. And I am going to make the claim, but again, the lecture will unpack this in much more detail than I can here. But I'm going to make the claim that there's a possibility that the internal mechanisms behind this music reflect those colonial or imperialistic viewpoints. Um, if you want to know more about that, then come to the lecture, I think is what I would say, because it would get, if I were to go much further down that road, it's going to get very detailed very quickly. I don't know that this is the right place for it, but you are absolutely right. That is an idea behind this lecture that I'm going to try to unpack a little bit next week.
But just to give people a taste of music theory and how interesting it is and fascinating, you talk about the dominant and the relationship between the dominant and tonic. Can you can
Yes,
can you at least tell us that before
absolutely.
we end our podcast? Because that's really fascinating, and you do such a great job making this rather arcane stuff, accessible to people like me.
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you to say. I hope I can pull that off on the night itself. But yes, I think these are terms. Sometimes these are terms that people who have had a passing interaction with music have heard. The idea of dominant and tonic, and really those are just labels. So they don't really have meaning in and of themselves. They have meaning when you understand how they are applied to music. And the use of the word tonic essentially refers to that chord, or sometimes that single note, that is the beginning chord or note of a scale or a key. So it's the place that you start and often the place you end. Because we're dealing with music that is, as what we say, tonal in nature. The tonal music exists because you can get a sense of being at home, departing away from home, and then coming back to home again. And the home is tonic. And so you start with tonic, you depart away from tonic, and then you come back to tonic. But as you might imagine, if all you have is a tonic, you don't really know it's a tonic. You've got to have something else to define it as tonic. And that's where the dominant comes in. So it is the dominant chord that I'm going to make the argument has embedded within it a particular structure that in its very nature drives you towards the tonic chord, and that the tonic chord has embedded in it a particular structure that feels at rest, feels like I say, like you're at home, like you have reached a point of repose where you do not feel a forward motion. So the relationship between the dominant, which has that sense of forward motion and forward drive, and the tonic, which has a sense of rest or being less active, being a little more passive, perhaps, that relationship, the drive of the dominant to the rest of the tonic, is what ultimately defines tonality. Because with just the tonic, you don't know it's a tonic. With the dominant, it defines the tonic, and that defines the relationship of dominant to tonic, which is tonal music. And because of that relationship, you can then extend that relationship into other keys and other connections, and you can start to have a quite complex web of tonality based around the primary idea that a dominant wants to drive you to its tonic. And that driving force, and whether or not the composer chooses to go in that direction or not, and the fact that the composer can play the dominant chord and set up in the listener an expectation of wanting to go in a certain direction, and then can choose whether or not the composer can choose whether or not they want to go in that direction, they want to meet that expectation or not, that is at the heart of tonal music. Of much Western art music. And honestly, then it's kind of at the heart of a lot of jazz music and a lot of popular music that kind of then comes after the common practice era, because those styles retain some of the elements of this tonal relationship between dominant and tonic.
I would suspect that most people are much more comfortable with tonal music, composers like Tchaikovsky and Brahms and Bach, than they are with atonal music like Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern. And even though those guys wrote their music, now more than 100 years ago, I think people still struggle with it. So I'd like your opinion. Do you think that an appreciation for tonality is innate to human beings, and a kind of a revulsion to atonality is also inherent? And to appreciate music like Schoenberg and Berg and those guys, you have to be taught and kind of go against your natural instincts to appreciate it.
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. It's a very loaded question, and if we have another 3 hours, I'll be able to unpack some of it. But to try and give you the sort of the 2 minute response to that, I think that there is. This is not original with me. This is what I'm about to say. I have a lot of time for some of the thinking, some of the ideas of the composer and philosopher John Cage. And he would talk about sound acting. He would say sound acts upon us. So it has an action, it has a force upon us. It causes a reaction in us as it acts upon us. And so an example of that is if you hear the sound of a babbling brook, we might have a reaction to that as that sound acts upon us. And probably that reaction, if it were a nice sunny day and we were enjoying sitting on the bank of a river or a small brook, we would probably have a relaxed, peaceful reaction to that. Whereas the sound of a fire alarm might cause a different reaction, right? I mean, a fire alarm is designed to get you to perk up and to feel uncomfortable because it wants you to get you to move out of the building. And I would make the argument that perhaps tied into those two extremely different sounds is a level of dissonance. And that it is whether or not the sound is dissonant, which would be harsh or clashing, rather like a fire alarm might be, or whether it is more consonant, which would be relaxed, restful, peaceful, which perhaps the sounds of the background noise of a babbling brook or the singing of songbirds on an early morning, these kinds of sounds perhaps are a little more consonant. And so perhaps the human reaction to tonal music and the reaction to so-called atonal music is more about a level of dissonance in the music. And if you think of dissonance and consonance as being two ends of a long spectrum, at the one end you might have very consonant sound, maybe a single pure tone. And at the other end, you might have very dissonant sound, maybe a cluster of many notes very close together being played right next to each other, perhaps in a sharp and repeated form. And somewhere between those two, you find various sounds could be plotted. So, the sound of Beethoven's going to fall somewhere. The sound of jazz music might fall somewhere. The sound of Schoenberg might fall somewhere. The sound of a fire alarm is going to fall somewhere. The sound of a babbling brook and fall. And so perhaps the human tendency toward one or the other form or style of music has to do with the level of dissonance embedded in it and how we react to dissonance versus consonance, as opposed to, getting into the weeds of whether or not we prefer Tchaikovsky over Schoenberg. It might have more to do with the sound world they're creating and the mechanisms they're using to create that sound world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember hearing a lecture by Joseph Goldstein, who is a mindfulness expert, but he was talking about a couple that he knew who just moved into a new home, and they heard this chirping in the basement, and they thought, "Oh, that's just so lovely. We have a lovely bird in our house. It's so great." And a few days go by, and they had to have a plumber come to their basement for some other reason. And he came up and he said, "Did you guys know your fire alarm isn't working?" And so, what before sounded really pleasant and sweet, no, isn't this great? All of a
Yeah.
sudden became very annoying, and they
Yeah.
had to fix it just as soon as possible.
Yes. That is fascinating. Well, and that made me think about the fact that I think the other thing is our relationship to things like dissonance can change over time. I think that there was a time when we would have considered, say, the music of Stravinsky to be very dissonant at its premiere and maybe not long afterwards, but that over time it's kind of become a little bit more. It just sounds a little bit more like an active movie score, if you will, and so our own relationship to dissonance, I think, changes over time. What we can tolerate and what we can accept and even call dissonant changes. And so I find that fascinating too. Are humans evolving is too strong a word, but are their tastes adapting such that things that feel dissonant at one time become more consonant as time passes? And I think that's fascinating when it comes to the study not only of music, but of many other things. If you define dissonance and consonance, to perhaps in visual terms, or you define it in other terms, maybe taste terms, in terms of cooking and food. I don't know. I'm not an expert in those areas, but I think that idea of contrast is something, and acceptance, and understanding over time is an interesting part of the human experience.
And like Stravinsky's music, I think a lot of the acceptance that had to do with that is just having musicians who championed it and appreciated it early on. Then you start to get the seal of approval from people, and then it's sort of like that. that annoying fire alarm starts to sound more like a, once
Yeah.
people start to explain it to you, then you can start to appreciate it more. But I think when people hear something for the first time, it's a little off-putting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. I agree 100%. I think the other thing that you're hinting at there, Patrick, which I think is a fascinating part of the understanding of music is it possible to appreciate something but not like it? And is it possible that as you appreciate something, you come to like it? And I think there's a lot of that wrapped up in this. I often teach 20th century music, which is a little outside of the scope of the lecture next week, but it's still interesting in terms of a broader understanding of music generally. And when I teach 20th century music, I often encourage the students that there may be musical sounds they hear that they don't like. But as we unpack why the composer was doing it, they might grow to appreciate it. So they could say, well, I appreciate that music, I just don't like it. And sometimes over the course of time, I'll hear a student come back to me maybe a few years later after they've graduated, and they'll say, you introduced me to such and such a composer in 20th century. And at the time, I appreciated it, but I didn't really like it. And I've grown now to like it. And so I think that's fascinating, the difference between liking and disliking and appreciating, but still acknowledging that while I appreciate it, I just don't like it. And then the possibility that over time, indeed, you actually come to like something that initially you didn't like. And that's a very human experience too. I mean, yeah, I don't know about you. We have when I was growing up in England, we would often have Stilton cheddar or Stilton cheese, not cheddar cheese, Stilton cheese. Stilton cheese is a blue cheese, has a very strong and pungent taste. And I remember tasting that as a kid and thinking, I hate this. I would never like this. But of course, I grow up and in my early 20s, I re-encounter it and I'm like, oh, this is actually quite tasty. And now I love the stuff. So I think changing our tastes over time, our tastes in the broadest sense, whether they be musical tastes or actual physical tastes, is a part of the human experience. And I think we do that by perhaps first appreciating and then maybe liking comes later. So
Well, I'm with you on Stilton, that's for sure.
good.
I mean, it's a lot more complex than American cheese,
It's more complex than most cheeses, let's
Yes,
face it.
it is. It is. Well, Dr. Ian Coleman is going to be giving a lecture. If you enjoyed what you've heard, you'll be able to hear a lot more and get a lot more insights, maybe a deeper appreciation of music. Uh, Ian, could you tell us again the name of the lecture and when and where?
Absolutely, yes. So it's the long title is Getting to the Heart of the Matter, Identifying the Driving Force Behind Common Practice Music and What It Reveals About Western Society. And it's going to be delivered next Wednesday, which is November the 13th at 7 p.m. on the campus of William Jewell College. It's in the Yates Gill Union, which is on the campus. It's on the central part of the campus. You would find it relatively easily if you come up onto the campus, and if you come into the Union building, it's on the second floor. But I'm sure there'll be people there just generally directing you in the right direction. So, William Jewell College Union, 7 p.m. Wednesday, the 13th of November next week.
Yeah, avail yourself of this priceless knowledge, which will be absolutely free. You really
Absolutely.
should do an online course, Ian. I think a lot of people would be very interested in this. And someday I want to talk to you just about your upbringing. How does a boy from England get into music theory? Because you were originally a musician, a pianist, is that right?
Well, I did do piano lessons from a relatively young age, and then later on, my primary instrument is actually trombone, and so I became a brass player and thoroughly enjoyed that. But yes, I got into music theory relatively early as well, and I think Patrick, that would be an excellent topic perhaps for another podcast where I'd be happy to share a little bit not only about my journey musically speaking, but the differences I observed then about the sort of the methods and practices both in music theory and in music generally, growing up in England versus what I observe and see over here in the United States. They're different, but it's not a good or bad or a better or worse. It's just it's interesting to have lived in both places and feel comfortable in both places, and to be able to see the benefits and the drawbacks of each place. So maybe that will give us some
I'd
rich
be
conversation
absolutely,
down the road.
I'd love that. No, that sounds great, Ian. We will plan on that.
Good.
But today I just want to thank you for coming on and talking about music theory and sharing with us that you're going to be doing this lecture on November 13th. I really appreciate it, Ian. I look forward to our next conversation, which I'm sure will also be very fascinating.
Well, they always are, Patrick. I always enjoy my conversations with you. So yes, I will look forward to that too.
All right. Good luck with your lecture and congratulations on that award. That's
Thank
really
you.
because you've been teaching at William Jewell for how long now?
Well, I've been teaching there for about 22 years,
Wow.
and so yeah, so a long time, long enough to learn a thing or two. You'd think, right?
Well, I'm sure you've taught people a thing or two as
Well,
well.
let's
All right. Well, thank you, Ian. Take care, and we will talk soon.